The accident. The rain was relentless, a torrential downpour that turned the roads into rivers and the night into an impenetrable veil. Clara gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white as she squinted through the windshield. The wipers worked furiously, but they were no match for the storm. Her heart pounded in her chest, a steady drumbeat of anxiety that matched the rhythm of the rain. She was late, so late, and the thought of missing her daughter's recital made her stomach churn. The car's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the slick asphalt ahead. Clara's mind raced, replaying the argument she'd had with her husband, Daniel, earlier that day. It had been about nothing and everything all at once: work, money, the usual suspects. But beneath the surface, there was something deeper, something unspoken. A distance that had grown between them, a chasm that neither of them knew how to bridge. The road curved sharply, and Clara's tires skidded on the wet pavement. She gasped, her breath catching in her throat as she fought to regain control. The car fishtailed, the back end swinging out dangerously. For a moment, she thought she had it, that she could straighten out and keep going. But then the world tilted, and everything went black. When Clara opened her eyes, the rain was gone. The storm had vanished, replaced by an eerie stillness. She was still in her car, but something was wrong. Terribly wrong. The air was thick, heavy, as if the world itself was holding its breath. She blinked, disoriented, and looked around. The road was empty, the trees motionless. Even the rain that had been pounding on the roof just moments ago was gone, replaced by a silence so profound it made her ears ring. Clara's heart raced as she fumbled with the seatbelt, her hands trembling. She pushed the door open and stepped out onto the pavement. The ground was dry, the air cool but not cold. She turned in a slow circle, taking in the scene around her. The world was frozen, as if someone had hit the pause button on reality. A bird hung suspended in midair, its wings spread but unmoving. A leaf, caught in an invisible breeze, hovered just above the ground, defying gravity. "Hello," Clara called out, her voice echoing in the stillness. There was no response, no sound at all except for the faint hum of her own breathing. She reached out and touched the leaf, half expecting it to crumble to dust at her touch. But it was solid, real, yet utterly immobile. Panic began to rise in her chest, a cold, creeping dread that made her stomach churn. She stumbled back to the car, her legs unsteady beneath her. The keys were still in the ignition, and she turned them, hoping against hope that the engine would roar to life and break the spell. But the car was silent, dead. The dashboard lights were off, the radio silent. Even the clock had stopped, the hands frozen at 8:17. Clara's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. She had been in an accident, that much was clear. But this was something else entirely. She felt a sharp pain in her side and looked down to see a deep gash in her shirt, blood staining the fabric. She touched it gingerly, wincing at the sting. The wound was fresh, but it didn't seem life-threatening. Still, it was a reminder that she was hurt, that she needed help. But there was no one around. No cars, no people, no signs of life. The world was empty, frozen in time. Clara's breath came in short, shallow gasps as she tried to calm herself. She needed to think, to figure out what to do next. But her mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion, and she couldn't focus. She started walking, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The road stretched out before her, endless and unchanging. She passed houses, their windows dark and lifeless. A dog stood on a porch, mid-bark, its teeth bared but silent. A child's bicycle lay on its side in a driveway, the wheels motionless. Clara's thoughts turned to her daughter, Emily. She had been on her way to the recital to see Emily play the piano. The thought of her daughter, alone and waiting, made her chest ache. She had to get home, had to find a way back to her family. But how? The world was frozen, time itself had stopped. How could she possibly find her way back? As she walked, the silence began to weigh on her, pressing down like a physical force. She felt isolated, cut off from everything she knew. The world around her was familiar yet alien. It was her world, but it wasn't. The colors were muted, the edges blurred, as if she were looking at a photograph that had been left out in the sun too long. Clara's steps slowed as she approached a small park. The swings hung motionless, the slide empty. A fountain in the center of the park was frozen mid-spray, the water suspended in the air like glass. She walked up to it, reaching out to touch the water. It was solid, unyielding, yet it shimmered with an otherworldly light. She felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of despair. This wasn't right. This wasn't how things were supposed to be. She had to find a way out, had to wake up from this nightmare. But deep down, she knew this wasn't a dream. This was real as the pain in her side and the blood on her shirt. Clara sank to her knees, her hands clutching at the ground. She felt tears welling up in her eyes, but they didn't fall. Even her tears were frozen, trapped in the stillness of this strange, frozen world. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, let me go back." But there was no answer, only the endless, unyielding silence. The frozen world. Clara didn't know how long she knelt there, her hands pressed against the cold, unyielding ground. Time had no meaning in this frozen world. The sky was a dull, unchanging gray, the sun hidden behind a veil of clouds that never moved. The air was still, devoid of any breeze, and the silence was so complete that it felt like a physical presence, pressing down on her. Eventually, she forced herself to stand. Her legs were stiff, her body aching from the accident and the cold. She looked around, trying to orient herself. The park was familiar. She had been here before with Emily. They had fed the ducks by the pond, laughed as they raced each other to the swings. But now, the pond was a sheet of glass, the ducks frozen in mid-quack, their beaks open but silent. Clara's heart ached as she thought of her daughter. Emily would be waiting for her, wondering why her mother hadn't shown up for the recital. The thought of her daughter's disappointment, her confusion, was almost too much to bear. Clara had to find a way back, had to get home. But how? The world was frozen, time itself had stopped. She was trapped in a moment that stretched on forever. She left the park and began to walk down the empty streets. The houses were silent, their windows dark. Cars were parked along the curb, their drivers frozen in place. A man stood on a ladder, painting a house, his brush suspended in midair. A woman walked her dog, the leash taut but unmoving. Clara reached out to touch the dog, but it was as solid and unyielding as stone. As she walked, Clara's mind raced, trying to make sense of what had happened. She had been in an accident, that much was clear. But this was something else. Had she died? Was this some kind of afterlife? But if so, why was she alone? Where was everyone else? And why was the world frozen in time? She passed a convenience store, the lights inside still on but flickering, as if they were struggling to stay alive. The door was slightly ajar, and Clara pushed it open, the bell above the door silent. The store was empty, the shelves stocked with goods that would never be bought. A cashier stood behind the counter, a smile frozen on her face, her hand outstretched as if to give change to a customer who would never come. Clara's stomach growled, and she realized she was hungry. She grabbed a bag of chips from the shelf, but when she tried to open it, the bag wouldn't tear. It was as if the chips were made of stone. She tried a bottle of water next, but the cap wouldn't budge. Frustrated, she slammed the bottle down on the counter, but it made no sound. She left the store and continued walking, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The streets were empty, the world devoid of life. She felt like the last person on earth, trapped in a world that had forgotten how to move. As she walked, Clara's thoughts turned to Daniel. She had been so angry with him earlier, so frustrated with their marriage. But now, all she wanted was to see him again, to feel his arms around her, to hear his voice. She thought of the way he would smile at her, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he laughed. She thought of the way he would hold Emily, so gently, so lovingly. She thought of the way he would kiss her forehead before he left for work in the morning, his lips warm against her skin. Tears welled up in her eyes, but they didn't fall. Even her tears were frozen, trapped in this endless moment. She felt a deep, aching loneliness, a longing for the life she had lost. She wanted to go back, to wake up from this nightmare and find herself in her own bed, with Daniel beside her and Emily sleeping peacefully in her room. But she knew that wasn't going to happen. This was real as the pain in her side and the blood on her shirt. She was trapped in this frozen world, and she had to find a way out. Clara's steps slowed as she approached her house. It looked the same as it always had, but something about it felt different. The windows were dark, the door slightly ajar. She pushed it open and stepped inside, her heart pounding in her chest. The house was silent, the air thick with the scent of dust and decay. The furniture was covered in a thin layer of frost, the walls lined with icicles. Clara's breath came out in visible puffs, the cold biting at her skin. She walked through the living room, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. She found Daniel in the kitchen, standing by the sink. He was frozen in place, a dish in one hand, a sponge in the other. His face was expressionless, his eyes staring straight ahead. Clara reached out to touch him, but he was as solid and unyielding as stone. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please wake up." But there was no response, only the endless, unyielding silence. Clara sank to her knees, her hands clutching at the ground. She felt tears welling up in her eyes, but they didn't fall. Even her tears were frozen, trapped in the stillness of this strange, frozen world. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, let me go back." But there was no answer, only the endless, unyielding silence. The light. Clara didn't know how long she stayed there, kneeling on the cold, hard floor of her kitchen, staring up at Daniel's frozen form. Time had no meaning in this world, and the silence was so complete that it felt like a physical presence, pressing down on her. She felt utterly alone, cut off from everything she had ever known. But then, something changed. At first, it was just a flicker, a tiny spark of light in the corner of her vision. Clara blinked, thinking it was her imagination, a trick of the mind brought on by exhaustion and despair. But the light didn't go away. Instead, it grew brighter, more intense, until it filled the room with a warm, golden glow. Clara shielded her eyes, squinting against the brightness. The light was coming from the living room, and she could feel its warmth even from where she knelt. It was a strange sensation, like the sun breaking through the clouds after a long, cold winter. She felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of hope, a feeling that she hadn't experienced since she woke up in this frozen world. She stood up, her legs trembling beneath her, and walked towards the light. As she entered the living room, she saw that the source of the light was a small, glowing orb, hovering in the air just above the coffee table. It pulsed with a gentle, rhythmic beat, like a heartbeat, and Clara felt drawn to it, as if it were calling out to her. She reached out to touch the orb, her fingers trembling. As soon as her skin made contact, she felt a surge of energy course through her body, warm and electric. The world around her began to shift, the frozen stillness giving way to movement and sound. The air grew warmer, the colors brighter, and Clara felt as if she were waking up from a long, deep sleep. The orb grew brighter, its light filling the room until Clara had to close her eyes against the intensity. She felt a sudden, sharp pain in her side, and when she opened her eyes again, she was no longer in her living room. She was lying on a hospital bed, surrounded by machines and monitors, their beeping and whirring filling the air. Clara blinked, disoriented, and tried to sit up, but a sharp pain in her side made her gasp. She looked down and saw that she was hooked up to N4, her arm bandaged and bruised. The room was dimly lit, the curtains drawn, but she could see Daniel sitting in a chair by the bed, his head in his hands. "Daniel," she croaked, her voice hoarse and weak. Daniel's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock. "Clara," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Oh my God, Clara, you're awake." He stood up and rushed to her side, taking her hand in his. His touch was warm, real, and Clara felt tears welling up in her eyes. This was real. She was back. She was alive. What happened? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel's face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. You were in an accident, he said, his voice breaking. You've been in a coma for weeks. The doctors, they didn't know if you were going to wake up. Clara's heart ached as she looked at him, seeing the pain and fear in his eyes. She squeezed his hand, trying to reassure him. I'm here, she said. I'm back. Daniel nodded, tears streaming down his face. I thought I lost you, he whispered. I thought you were gone. Clara reached up with her free hand, touching his face. I'm here, she repeated. I'm not going anywhere. Daniel leaned down, pressing his forehead against hers. I love you, he said, his voice trembling. I love you so much. I love you too, Clara whispered, her voice breaking. I'm so sorry, Daniel, for everything. Daniel shook his head. Don't be sorry, he said. Just be here. That's all that matters. Clara nodded, tears streaming down her face. She felt a deep sense of relief, of gratitude, for being back in the world, for being alive. But she also felt a lingering sense of unease, a memory of the frozen world she had been trapped in. It had felt so real, so vivid, and she couldn't shake the feeling that it had been more than just a dream. As the days passed and Clara began to recover, she found herself thinking more and more about the frozen world. She tried to push the thoughts away, to focus on her recovery and on being with her family, but the memories lingered, like a shadow at the edge of her mind. One night, as she lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, she turned to Daniel. Do you believe in alternate realities? She asked, her voice hesitant. Daniel looked at her, his brow furrowed. What do you mean? He asked. Clara hesitated, unsure of how to explain. I mean, do you think it's possible that there are other worlds, other versions of reality, where things are different? Daniel was silent for a moment, considering her question. I don't know, he said finally. I guess anything's possible. Why do you ask? Clara sighed, her mind racing. When I was in the coma, I had this dream, or maybe it wasn't a dream, felt so real. I was in a world where everything was frozen, where time had stopped. I was alone, and I couldn't find anyone. It was terrifying. Daniel reached out, taking her hand in his. It was just a dream, he said gently. You're here now. You're safe. Clara nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it had been more than just a dream. She had felt so alone, so cut off from everything she knew. And the light that had brought her back. It had felt so real, so powerful. As she drifted off to sleep that night, Clara found herself thinking about the frozen world again. She wondered if it was still out there, frozen in time, waiting for her to return. Or maybe it was just a figment of her imagination, a creation of her mind as it struggled to cope with the trauma of the accident. But deep down, she knew that it had been real. It had been a part of her journey back to the world of the living. And as she closed her eyes, she felt a sense of peace, knowing that she had made it back, that she had returned from the darkness. And as she slept, she dreamed of the light, warm and golden, guiding her home.